Why would you even make it like this again?" Those were the words my mother spat out with a sharp edge while I stood frozen in the narrow kitchen of our old family house on Maple Street in Evanston, Illinois. It was 2:43 p.m. on a Wednesday afternoon, and I had just finished carefully ladling the creamy tomato basil soup. I had spent exactly 47 minutes preparing with fresh Roma tomatoes, 3 cloves of garlic, and a hint of smoked paprika, and the aroma of simmering soup had filled the air, mixing with the faint smell of the polished oak cabinets and the slightly burnt toast from breakfast still lingering in the corner of the room. I had chosen to make this soup because she had been coughing all week, and I remembered her voice from Monday morning when she said with that thin but gentle tone that I must be careful with what I eat because her stomach was sensitive, and my father had already reminded her that eating something wrong could trigger the reflux again. But as I carefully presented the bowl balancing on the faded floral apron I had worn since my high school prom, she looked at me cross her arms and sneered with an expression that could curdle milk faster than the soup simmering on the stove. I froze because the words hit harder than any argument we had ever had. The kitchen clock ticked loudly, 2:44, 12 p.m., and I felt my hands tremble as if the spoons I had polished and lined up on the counter were mocking me for failing to meet her expectations. I remembered every summer Saturdays spent in this very kitchen when I was 10, helping her peel carrots and onions, counting out 17 carrots exactly to make her famous stew, remembering the smell of her old perfume mixed with the earthy scent of the vegetables. I had thought those days had taught me how to care, how to listen, how to anticipate the subtle signs of discomfort. But now in one sentence, all that seemed meaningless, I opened my mouth to respond, to defend myself, to explain that I had followed the recipe she had dictated step by step with precision for 15 minutes exactly, while stirring clockwise with a wooden spoon that had been in our family for over 35 years. But before I could speak, she snapped again with a cruel tone that reverberated off the faded yellow wallpaper. "I told you last week not to add the paprika. It burns my throat. Why can't you ever listen?" I could feel my heart hammering against my rib cage, sweat forming tiny beads along my hairline, and the faint taste of tomatoes still lingering on my lips. It was like the walls of the kitchen had closed in, and my past efforts, the 3 grocery trips I had made to get fresh organic tomatoes, the $21.76 I spent on the basil, and cream suddenly felt like a cruel joke. And in exactly 15 minutes from the moment I had poured the first ladle, she had managed to erase all my investment, my love, my intention. With just words, I looked past her and saw the neighbor, Mrs. Collins, standing on her porch across the street, recording the scene on her old flip phone, the camera capturing every trembling finger, every flash of panic in my eyes, every betrayed glance of my mother, as if the entire block had become a silent jury witnessing my humiliation. I felt my hands curl into fists and the soup bowl shake slightly as I struggled to contain the rising heat of my anger. My father still in his armchair upstairs, oblivious to the battle in the kitchen, and I whispered to myself, a shaky, desperate voice, "I cannot believe this is happening," knowing deep down that this argument over soup was spiraling into something much larger, something that would leave a mark that could not be erased by a simple apology or a few more hours of simmering on the stove. And in that moment, I realized that the story about the soup was no longer about the food. It was about recognition, about respect, about the years of love and care that seemed to evaporate in the cruel summer air of Evanston, Illinois, that Wednesday afternoon. And as I set the spoon down with a clatter that echoed like a warning, I thought to myself, in 15 minutes, everything could change and everything would be revealed. And if you have ever felt your heart break over something seemingly trivial and yet so deeply personal, you know exactly what I mean. Share your thoughts below, because what happened next would completely change everything in a way I never could have imagined. And in that kitchen, with the lingering smell of tomato and burnt toast, I understood that the journey of humiliation and revelation had just begun. I had always believed that caring for my mother was not just a duty, but a way to honor decades of sacrifice. She had spent her youth teaching me piano lessons at 8:30 a.m. every weekday in our cramped living room on Oak Avenue in Chicago. She'd used a second-hand upright piano purchased in 1967 for $243.50 that still held a faint scent of varnish and the echoes of my clumsy fingers practicing scales. With tears streaming down my cheeks, I remembered vividly the summer of 1978, when she had stayed up every night knitting scarves for the local church bazaar, while my father worked double shifts at the factory to ensure we had food on the table. And I watched her hands move deftly over the yarn, feeling the warmth of the wool, and the faint smell of her lavender soap permeate the tiny apartment. She had always been meticulous, and carrying every Christmas from 1985 to 1992, she had baked exactly 24 gingerbread cookies lined in neat rows on the cooling rack for our neighbors down the street. The sweet smell of cinnamon and molasses filling our house while I tried to sneak one or two without her noticing, and those acts of generosity were not limited to holidays. She had volunteered every Tuesday and Thursday from 1999 to 2006 at the Evanston Senior Center, serving soup and sandwiches to the elderly, and lonely counting the sandwiches twice to make sure no one was left out, and I had followed in her footsteps. Since I turned 18, helping her every Saturday morning from 10:15 to 1:45 with a team of 5 volunteers chopping vegetables, peeling potatoes, listening to the low hum of the fluorescent lights and the faint clatter of metal trays. And each time I had done it, I felt the satisfaction of contributing something meaningful. And yet now, as I stood in that narrow kitchen, watching her dismiss my effort to prepare a simple bowl of soup, I felt as if all those years of shared love and labor had been reduced to nothing in that moment. I remembered the countless times I had picked up the $32.50 tab for her prescription medications over the last 3 months, the 12 trips to the grocery store last week alone to buy fresh vegetables, and Herb's the 2-hour drive on a rainy Tuesday to pick up her new reading glasses from Lens Crafters on Main Street, Chicago, and yet the expression on her face said, I had failed despite every ounce of effort, every dollar spent, every careful calculation. And as I thought about it, I realized that the first small signs of disrespect had been there for months. The time she had sharply told me that my choice of $27.99 organic olive oil was unnecessary, the subtle sigh when I offered to help fold laundry she had done since 1965, with meticulous precision, a glance she gave when I suggested we play the old radio from 1974. She used to love listening to the Beatles every evening as I prepared dinner, and yet I ignored them, thinking perhaps she was tired, or that I was imagining things, and flashbacks flooded me, the soft clinking of china plates from 1979 when I had set the table for my grandparents to smell of freshly brewed coffee from the percolator in the morning of 1982, when she taught me how to pour without spilling, the sticky sweet scent lingering in the kitchen, the way her hands would brush mine, gently correcting my grip on a knife or whisk. All those memories now weighed heavily as I realized that the emotional investment I had made was not just about this one bowl of soup. It was decades of devotion spent meticulously observing her habits, counting the exact number of carrot slices in her stew, noting that she preferred 4 slices of cucumber exactly on the plate, and balancing salt and pepper in precise quantities, the very essence of carrying action. And now my investment met rejection and dismissal. It was like standing on the edge of a cliff, looking down at years of commitment evaporating into thin air. And I tried to speak to her again. Mom, I spent almost an hour chopping the tomatoes and simmering the soup, exactly 15 minutes. I followed the instructions from Monday precisely. My voice cracked slightly, and she barely glanced up. I don't care. I told you not to do it this way. I can't eat it like this, she said flatly, with the kind of finality that seemed to erase all my effort, and the subtle sounds of the kitchen became deafening, the ticking of the old clock on the wall, the hum of the refrigerator, the faint dripping from the faucet, each sound magnifying the sense of helplessness. And I noticed once more that Mrs. Collins across the street had not stopped recording the instant, the old flip phone capturing every detail, a witness to my frustration, my care, my dedication. And I realized in that moment that this was not just about soup. It was a microcosm of every moment I had tried to care and been dismissed, every gesture loved disregarded, every dollar spent unappreciated. And I whispered to myself almost inaudibly, I cannot keep ignoring this. I cannot pretend this is just a simple disagreement. And a wave of emotion swelled, knowing that what I was about to face in the next hours would require more than cooking skill. It would require strategy, patience, and perhaps a courage I had not yet fully realized. And if you have ever dedicated yourself to someone only to feel invisible in return, think about that feeling and hold it close, because the story is just beginning and the escalation of humiliation is about to unfold. Wait until you see what happens next, because what you would do in my position might surprise you. And as I set the soup down on the counter again, the aroma of basil and tomatoes mixing with the faint musty smell of the old kitchen, I braced myself for the next chapter of this journey. The tension in the kitchen grew thicker than the tomato soup simmering on the stove. The clock read exactly 2:57 p.m., and I felt my chest tighten as if the walls themselves were pressing on me. I tried to take a deep breath and composed myself, reminding myself that I had spent $21.76 on the fresh basil alone, the 3 Roma tomatoes from Lake County, the precise 3 cloves of garlic, and yet nothing seemed to matter. My mother crossed her arms again and said with a tone dripping with contempt, "You never listen to me. Why do you even try?" I wanted to explain that I had counted the minutes exactly, that I had stirred clockwise for exactly 15 rotations, that I had even adjusted the heat to maintain a gentle simmer, but before I could utter a single word, she snapped again, "Stop making excuses. I don't want it like this." And I felt my face flush red, the old linoleum under my feet cold against the soles of my socks. I remembered my father warning me over the phone the night before, "Wilson, don't let small things get to you. She is just tired." But in that moment, I could feel the humiliation spreading through me like wildfire, and I realized this was no longer about tiredness. This was a public spectacle, because neighbors had started gathering on the sidewalk across the street, Mrs. Collins still holding her flip phone recording the entire ordeal, Mr. Jenkins from 412 Maple Street peeking through the window, shaking his head, muttering, "Poor kid," and even the mailman paused his truck to observe. The drama unfolding in real time, I tried one last attempt to defuse the tension. "Mom, please." I spent almost an hour chopping the vegetables and simmering it for exactly 15 minutes. "I just wanted to make something you would enjoy," I said softly, my voice almost trembling, and she rolled her eyes with a kind of arrogance that seemed to grow by the minute. "I don't care. I can't eat it like this," she said sharply, and it was like the words pierced me physically. I looked down at the soup, the creamy red liquid swirling gently in the bowl, steam curling upward, and I saw for the first time the 3 tiny specks of paprika on the surface, the exact ingredient she had forbidden the week before. Yet I had hoped she would trust me to improve on a recipe. I had followed her instructions, and yet she made me feel like a complete fool in front of everyone. I remembered back to 1984, when I had won the science fair for Evanston Middle School, building a small model volcano that erupted perfectly every time, and she had proudly snapped pictures with her old Canon E, one camera showing the print to neighbors. And now I realized that all those past accolades meant nothing, because in the present moment her disdain erased every memory of achievement. I felt a sudden surge of desperation and tried to appeal to reason. "Mom, you told me last Monday to try adding a pinch of paprika to see if it improves the flavor," she scoffed. "That was just an experiment." "I don't want experiments. I want obedience." And the words stung like hot coals against the raw skin of my pride. I noticed that my hands were shaking, and I almost knocked over the $7.43 bottle of extra virgin olive oil I had bought at Whole Foods on Saturday. I could hear the distant sound of children playing in the street, the squeal of bicycle tires, and the faint chime of the ice cream truck passing by, yet none of it distracted me from the mounting sense of humiliation. And I realized that the problem was not just the soup. It was a repeated pattern of dismissal, the subtle but growing arrogance in her voice, the way she had ignored my last 3 attempts at conversation in the past week. And now in front of witnesses, it became painfully clear that tolerance had its limits. I remembered last Tuesday, when I had carefully folded her 24 blue and white hand towels, counting each fold meticulously, and she had muttered, "You always do it wrong." And now that same scorn was being applied to my cooking, my care, my love, and I could feel a knot forming in my stomach, as if the humiliation itself was a physical weight pressing down on me. I tried to step back and take a moment. "Mom, please, can we just talk calmly? I am only trying to help." She shook her head sharply. "I don't want your help. I want you to stop trying." And I felt a line cross inside me, a boundary I had silently upheld for decades being violated in front of the world, and the witnesses from across the street had grown more audacious. Mrs. Collins whispering to the neighbor next door, "Can you believe this?" as she zoomed in with her camera on my trembling hands, and Mr. Jenkins shaking his head, muttering, "Poor kid," as if my life experience counted for nothing. And it hit me that the humiliation was intentional, that this was not fatigue or accident. This was a display of power, and I realized I had to make a conscious decision in the next few moments, whether crumble under the weight or prepare for what was to come. And I whispered under my breath, almost inaudibly, "I cannot let this continue. I will not let this continue." The aroma of simmering tomatoes and garlic filling the air, mixing with the faint smell of burnt toast from breakfast and the faint, earthy scent of the wooden spoon in my hand. I felt a fire building inside me, a clarity forming. And as I glanced around the room at the old clock, 2:59 p.m., the faded yellow wallpaper, the chipped ceramic sink, the very embodiment of our shared history, I knew the story was no longer about soup. It was about justice, respect, and finally taking a stand. Wait until you see the next part where the line is crossed and the decision is made, because what happened next would change everything in ways nobody expected. I stood there in the kitchen, the remnants of the creamy tomato basil soup still simmering on the stove. 2 p.m., and I realized that something inside me had shifted. The humiliation, the repeated dismissals, the scornful glances across the street from Mrs. Collins and Mr. Jenkins all converged into a single undeniable clarity. I could no longer allow myself to be invisible to her, to let decades of care and devotion be erased by a single cruel word or a harsh tone. I remembered vividly the Tuesday evening in 2003 when I had spent 3 hours meticulously assembling my first investment portfolio for my father, helping him balance his small retirement savings at $14, $325.68 with careful calculations and charts printed on the old Epson printer, the smell of ink and paper filling the office, and the pride in his eyes as he understood that I had helped secure his future. And I realized that I possessed a similar quiet power, now a capability. She could not dismiss, a tool she could not ignore, and yet I had to be strategic, not reckless. I had to act with precision, with dignity, not out of anger. I took a slow breath and let the faint aroma of garlic and tomatoes fill my lungs. I ran my fingers over the chipped countertop, feeling the cool smoothness of the marble mixed with the faint roughness of the laminate edges. And I began to form a plan, a silent calculation forming in my mind. I remembered all the subtle signs she had given over the past months, the dismissive remarks about my olive oil, purchases of scorn for my careful folding of laundry, the eye rolls when I suggested a song from the old 1978 radio playlist she once loved, and I understood that each instance was a piece of the puzzle, a map of behavior I could use to guide my response. I walked slowly to the window, peering out at the gathered neighbors, Mrs. Collins filming with her old flip phone, Mr. Jenkins shaking his head, muttering, "Poor kid," and I knew that their presence was a double-edged sword. They bore witness to my humiliation, but they would also bear witness to my assertion control. When the time came, I whispered quietly under my breath, "I will not react impulsively. I will not let anger cloud my judgment. I will act with intention." The words ground to me, the faint sound of the refrigerator humming a steady note, the ticking of the kitchen clock. 4 p.m. marking the passage of time, each second a reminder that the opportunity to shift the narrative was slipping away, and I moved with calm precision to collect the evidence of my investment, the receipts for the fresh tomatoes, $12.43, the organic basil, $9.33, the 3 cloves of garlic, and $0.60 the bowl itself, hand-picked at the Evanston thrift store for $6.75, all carefully saved in a neat stack. I remembered conversations with my late uncle in 1998 about the importance of documenting everything. Precise numbers, dates, times, actions, and I understood now how those lessons applied to this moment, the subtle but growing arrogance in her voice, the repeated dismissal, the scoff, the eye rolls, all became data points for the strategy one was about to enact. I set the receipts neatly on the counter and took a moment to glance at the simmering soup, the aroma of basil and tomatoes mixing with a faint smell of burnt toast from breakfast. The clock now 5 p.m., and I felt a sense of calm determination wash over me, my heart still pounding slightly, but no longer with panic, but with focus. I remembered vividly the lessons from decades of observation, patience and calculation paying off slowly over time like a fine chess game, and I realized that I had reached a point where I could no longer be passive, where I could no longer endure. Without response, I glanced at my mother, her arms crossed, her gaze sharp and scornful, yet unaware that the dynamic had shifted, that the quiet power she had underestimated was now preparing to emerge. I whispered under my breath, almost inaudibly, "This ends now, but with precision, not spite," the words anchoring my resolve, and I began to prepare mentally for the revelation, the careful unfolding of evidence and documentation that would change everything, that would force recognition, not through anger, but through undeniable clarity. And as I looked around the kitchen at the faded yellow wallpaper, the chipped ceramic sink, the small clock on the wall, ticking steadily at 6 p.m., I felt the calm before the storm, the clarity before action, and knew that the next moments would define not just the dinner, but the years of care and dedication. And as I tightened my grip on the wooden spoon used for stirring the soup, I thought to myself, what would she do when she realized that this was no longer a simple meal, no longer a trivial disagreement, but a turning point, a moment where decades of respect and love demanded acknowledgement? Wait until the next chapter, because the revelation of power is about to unfold, and what she did not expect would leave everyone watching stunned. By 12 p.m. the kitchen had taken on a charged stillness, as if every surface, the faded yellow wallpaper, the chipped ceramic sink, and even the simmering tomato basil soup knew that something was about to change. I calmly retrieved the neatly stacked receipts, the $12.43 spent on fresh Roma tomatoes, $9.33 on organic basil, $0.60 on 3 cloves of garlic, the careful $6.75 thrift store bowl I had handpicked, and placed them deliberately in front of my mother, her eyes narrowing with suspicion as she crossed her arms once more. "What are you doing now?" She snapped with a hint of irritation in her tone, and I looked her straight in the eyes. "Mom, I want you to see everything clearly," I said with a calm, measured voice that contrasted sharply with my earlier panic. All the time, the care, the attention, every detail, every dollar, every minute spent was done with the sole purpose of making you comfortable. The bowl, the ingredients, even the simmering time, 15 minutes, exactly as discussed last Monday. I slid the receipts across the counter, and order each label with date and amount, and the aroma of the simmering soup wafted around us like a gentle reminder. My effort. The room was quiet, except for the faint hum of the refrigerator, the ticking of the kitchen clock, 3:13 p.m., and the shallow intake of breath of my mother as she looked down at the evidence for the first time. She blinked slowly, the scorn faltering. I didn't," she stammered, and the words caught in her throat as if the years of dismissal were crashing back at her all at once. Mrs. Collins, across the street, was still recording, zooming in on my hands, the receipts, the bowl, the careful arrangement of evidence, and I noticed for the first time a subtle shift in the gathered neighbors, the whispers of, "I didn't realize. Look at all that work." The mailman pausing mid-step, his eyes widening, and Mr. Jenkins muttering under his breath, "Now I see it." And it hit me that the power I quietly accumulated over decades had become undeniable. The meticulous attention to detail, the patience, the strategy, the documentation had turned the tide. I took a deep breath, the aroma of basil and garlic filling my senses, and continued. "Mom, every attempt to dismiss my care, every time I was told my actions were unnecessary, I documented, I prepared, I accounted for it all, and now you can see that the effort was real and the intention sincere." And she finally looked up, her expression shifting from scorn to shock, her eyes widening as she realized that the dismissals could not erase the truth. The evidence was undeniable, the receipts, the carefully measured ingredients, the precise simmering times, the repeated acts of love, compiled into a story she could not ignore, and the neighbors witnessed every moment. Mrs. Collins whispering, "This is incredible," as she zoomed in on the receipts, capturing each dollar spent, each minute counted, and I could feel a wave of vindication washing over me, not from anger, but from the quiet recognition that truth had its own power. I reached for the wooden spoon holding the soup and lifted it gently. "This soup, this effort, this moment represents more than a meal. It represents respect, care, and the attention you have sometimes forgotten to acknowledge," I said softly, and she swallowed hard, fumbling for words. I never realized," she murmured, her voice small and uncertain, as the realization sank and that her scorn could not erase decades of devotion, and the dynamic of the kitchen shifted completely. The air felt lighter, the tension replaced by a cautious. All the witnesses from across the street nodded silently, some whispering encouragement, others shaking their heads in astonishment, and I knew that the revelation of my capability, my hidden power, had completely inverted the hierarchy that had been so cruelly imposed to the past hour. For the first time in decades, my mother looked at me not with scorn, but with a faint flicker of recognition and remorse, the kind that comes only when someone fully comprehends the magnitude of their misjudgment. And I whispered quietly under my breath, "The truth always finds its way." The simmering aroma of the soup, a gentle reminder of the effort and care behind every act, and in that moment the crowd outside the kitchen window could see clearly that the humiliation had been replaced by acknowledgement, the quiet power of preparation, strategy, and evidence, turning the tide of control and respect. And if you have ever felt dismissed, ignored, or belittled, remember that the meticulous accumulation of truth, patience, and calm determination can completely reverse the story. And in the next chapter, you will see the immediate consequences unfolding, the justice delivered in real time, the way recognition corrects imbalance, and the shift in power becomes undeniable. Wait until you witness what happens next, because the humiliation that began with a single cruel sentence is about to be fully reversed in front of everyone in Evanston, Illinois at 3:17 p.m. The transformation of authority and respect is about to be completed. By 3 20 p.m. The kitchen felt like a stage, the simmering tomato basil soup still steaming gently, but now carrying a different energy, the previous tension replaced by a quiet awe as my mother stared down at the neatly stacked receipts, the $12.43 for fresh Roma tomatoes, $9.33 for organic basil, $0.60 for 3 cloves of garlic, and the $6.75 thrift store bowl, all evidence. Meticulously documented and arranged, it was as if the universe had tilted slightly to reveal the truth in real time. I could feel the neighbors outside adjusting their stance on the sidewalk, Mrs. Collins still holding her flip phone, recording every detail, zooming in on my hands on the bowl and the receipts, capturing every dollar spent, every minute invested, and Mr. Jenkins shaking his head, muttering, finally he's being seen, and the mailman pausing mid-step, realizing the gravity of what was unfolding. I took a measured breath, the faint aroma of garlic and basil filling the kitchen, mixing with the residual scent of burnt toast from breakfast, and I addressed my mother with calm authority. Mom, this has never been about the soup itself. It has been about the recognition of care, the acknowledgement of effort, and the respect that should accompany decades of devotion. My voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my veins, and she looked up at me, eyes wide, lips slightly parted, fumbling for words. I didn't mean... She began, but I held up a hand, gently signaling that words alone were not enough, and the consequence of her dismissals was unfolding visibly across the room, and across the street, the neighbors nodding, murmuring support, the reality of her misjudgment becoming evident to everyone watching, Mrs. Collins whispering, "You can see it all now." Zooming in on the receipts, capturing the $32.76 I had spent on ingredients in total, and the precise 15 minutes of simmering time documented on my notes, the meticulous planning that had gone into every step, and I continued calmly. Each act of dismissal, each scoff, each eye roll had consequences that could no longer be ignored, and now they are. And I watched as a subtle shift occurred in her demeanor, the arrogance giving way to humility, the scorn replaced with tentative acknowledgement. She took a step back, eyes dropping to floor, fumbling with her hands, as if suddenly aware that the decades of care I had invested could not be erased by words alone. And the immediate effect was palpable. The kitchen atmosphere shifted, the power dynamic, inverted, the witnesses outside nodded, quietly acknowledging the justice. In real time, the ice of humiliation melting into the warmth of recognition. I recall the exact moment when I had first realized the potential for change. The 2:59 p.m. line crossed the calm determination at 3. 5 p.m. the preparation, and now at 3:20 p.m. the consequences manifesting fully in the most public yet dignified manner. I set the wooden spoon gently back into the simmering soup and noted the faint curve of steam rising, a reminder of the care I had put into meal, the subtle sounds of the refrigerator humming, the ticking of the kitchen clock. 3:21 p.m. the faint squeak of the cabinet hinge as she shifted slightly, all details amplifying the reality of change, and I whispered softly under my breath, "Justice does not always roar. Sometimes it arrives quietly with undeniable clarity." And the final proof of consequence appeared as she finally spoke clearly and slowly. I see now. I should have," her voice breaking under the weight of recognition and remorse, the neighbors whispering encouragement. "See, he was right. Finally." And I felt a subtle but deep satisfaction, the kind that comes from careful strategy, patience, and unwavering integrity. The humiliation I had endured now fully inverted the respect, restored the dynamic balance in a way that left no doubt. And I looked at Mrs. Collins across the street and nodded ever so slightly, acknowledging her witness of the transformation. The mailman now walking past, slowly shaking his head, and Mr. Jenkins leaning on his fence, muttering softly, "Everything makes sense now." And the kitchen felt lighter, the faint smell of basil and tomatoes enveloping the space, mixing with the memory of burnt toast, the tactile feel of the cool countertop under my fingers, the subtle warmth of the simmering soup. And I realized in that moment that the immediate consequences were not just for my mother, but for me as well, for decades of quiet patience and meticulous effort validated in front of everyone finally. And I whispered to myself, "This changes everything." The humiliation erased, the respect restored, the justice delivered visibly in real time. And if you have ever felt dismissed, ignored, below, remember that patience, strategy, and evidence can create consequences that resonate instantly with clarity and fairness. Wait until you see the final chapter, because the transformation and reflection that follows will leave you with lessons you can carry for a lifetime and connect deeply with your own experiences. By 3:30 p.m., the kitchen had transformed from a battlefield into a space of quiet reflection, the simmering tomato basil soup no longer a source of humiliation, but a symbol of patience, care, and deliberate action. The aroma of fresh basil and garlic mingling with the faint trace of burnt toast from breakfast, the air carrying the warmth of recognition and restored respect. I looked at my mother, her eyes softer, now filled with a mix of remorse and newfound understanding. I never realized how much effort you put into this, she said quietly, her voice tinged with regret, and I felt a calm wash over me. Decades of subtle gestures of care finally acknowledged, not through confrontation, but through meticulous documentation and unwavering patience. I thought back to my childhood, the countless Saturdays spent peeling carrots, chopping onions, listening to the faint hum of the old refrigerator, counting out exactly 17 carrots for her famous stew, the scent of her lavender soap mingling with the earthy smell of vegetables, and I realized that those moments had shaped my approach to care. And now to justice, I stepped closer, gently. Mom, it was never about being perfect or about the soup itself. It was about being seen, being acknowledged for the care and attention invested, I said softly, and she nodded slowly, understanding dawning in her expression. For the first time, she realized that dismissal could not erase the reality of effort, and that recognition was not granted. Lightly, it had to be earned, and now earned was I glanced around the kitchen, noticing the faint flicker of sunlight through the faded yellow wallpaper, the smoothness of the countertop, under my fingertips the gentle steam rising from the bowl, and I understood that transformation was as much internal as it was visible in the reactions of others. Mrs. Collins, still recording across the street, nodding in approval, Mr. Jenkins leaning on the fence, whispering, finally clarity, and even the mailman pausing mid-step to witness the subtle but undeniable shift in dynamic, and I felt the lesson crystallized. Patience, documentation, and strategic calm could turn humiliation into recognition, invisibility into acknowledgement, power into quiet justice. And I turned to the camera, as if speaking to anyone who had ever felt overlooked, ignored, or dismissed. If you have ever dedicated yourself to someone only to feel invisible, remember that careful preparation, patience, and calm persistence can turn the tide and change everything in a single moment, I said gently, inviting the viewer into the experience. Share your own stories below, because together we can see the power of quiet strategy and care. And I continued, subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell to join our community where respect, care, and thoughtful action matter. And the aroma of basil and garlic seemed to underscore every word, a sensory reminder of effort met with recognition. I recalled the subtle textures of the day, the cool linoleum under my feet, the faint hum of the refrigerator, the ticking of the clock, 3:33 p.m., and realized that transformation was cumulative, the result of countless small acts accumulated over years, now acknowledged finally. And I smiled softly, thinking about the lesson for anyone watching, whether you are 50 or beyond, or simply someone who has felt overlooked. Patience, preparation, and integrity always carry weight, even when initially invisible, and the hum of the kitchen became a background symphony, the simmering soup, a gentle metaphor for careful attention, the receipts neatly stacked, proof of intentionality. And I whispered under my breath, never underestimate the quiet power of consistent care. And as my mother gently touched my shoulder for the first time that afternoon, I realized that respect cannot be demanded, it must be earned, and recognition may be delayed, but when it arrives, it is transformative. And I turned back to the camera. Leave your thoughts below, comment your experiences, because there is power in sharing and understanding. And I continued, if this story inspired you to see your own efforts differently, share it with someone who needs to witness it. And finally, remember to subscribe and activate the notification bell to continue following stories where patient strategy and thoughtful action create real change. And the sunlight shifted slightly across the faded yellow wallpaper. The kitchen smelled of basil, garlic, and faint burnt toast of wooden spoon resting gently in the simmering soup bowl, a symbol of patience, care, and vindication. And in that moment, I felt a deep sense of closure, that humiliation had been replaced by acknowledgement, dignity, restored justice served, and I knew that the lessons of the day would stay with me and anyone watching for a lifetime, because transformation comes not from anger or haste, but from calm, deliberate action and the recognition of value, even when overlooked for decades. And as I set the bowl carefully on the counter, I thought softly to myself, every act of care matters, every detail counts, and when the world finally sees that, the effect is profound. And with that, the story of humiliation, transformation, and reflection came to a close, leaving the lessons clear, the emotions raw, and the invitation open for viewers to engage, share, and grow with us.